The Leviathan is a creature of such immense size that even the largest animals on earth seem tiny by comparison. It is a being so powerful that even the bravest warriors tremble in its presence. Now, imagine that this creature isn't just a product of a fantasy writer's imagination, but is described in detail within the pages of the Bible. We speak of the Leviathan, the greatest and most fearsome beast mentioned in the Holy Scriptures. But what exactly is the Leviathan? Why did God dedicate so many verses to describe this enigmatic being? And what does it represent for us today? This video will dive deep into the Bible to uncover this legendary beast's mysteries. To begin our journey, let's go back to the beginning, to the book of Job, where we find the most detailed description of the Leviathan. In chapter 41, God challenges Job with a series of rhetorical questions about this formidable creature. Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Job 41. 1. Right from the first verse, we realize that we are dealing with something extraordinary. God isn't referring to an ordinary fish or even a great shark. The tone used suggests a creature of unmatched proportions and power. As we continue reading, the description becomes even more impressive and terrifying. God continues his discourse by asking, "Can you make a pet of it like a bird, or put it on a leash for the young women in your house?" Job 41 verse 5. This ironic comparison between the Leviathan and a bird emphasizes how absurd it would be for a human to try to tame or control this creature. The Leviathan is portrayed as something beyond human reach and understanding, defying any attempt at domestication or conquest. The description of the Leviathan in Job continues with increasingly striking details. Who dares open the doors of its mouth, ringed about with fearsome teeth? Job 41:14. This passage evokes an image of powerful jaws capable of crushing anything in their path. The text proceeds to describe the Leviathan's scales as shields that are so tightly bound that no air can pass between them. Job 41:15 through 16. This depiction of impenetrable armor leads us to question, what kind of creature is this, that even air cannot penetrate its defenses? The answer comes in the following verses, which paint a picture of an almost invulnerable beast. The sword that reaches it has no effect, nor does the spear or the dart or the javelin. Job 41 verse 26. This passage suggests that no human weapon can harm the Leviathan, making it an opponent impossible to defeat by human strength. But why is God describing this creature to Job? What is the purpose of this elaborate portrayal of an invincible being? The answer to this question begins to unfold when we consider the context of the book of Job. Job, a righteous man who endured terrible trials, questioned God's justice. In response, God doesn't offer a direct explanation for Job's suffering, but instead presents a series of examples of his power and wisdom in creation, culminating in the description of the Leviathan. This approach suggests that the Leviathan is not just a physical creature, but a symbol of God's incomprehensible power and the complexity of creation. By describing a creature completely beyond human control, God says to Job, "If you cannot understand or control even this creature that I made, how can you expect to understand my ways and my purposes fully?" This interpretation of the Leviathan as a symbol of divine power and the limitations of human understanding is supported by other passages in the Bible that mention this enigmatic creature. One of these crucial passages is in Psalm 74, where the psalmist recalls God's mighty acts in creation and the history of Israel. In verse 14 we read, "It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert." This reference to the Leviathan occurs in the context of a description of the world's creation. suggesting that the Leviathan represents the forces of chaos that God had to subdue to establish order in the universe. This interpretation is reinforced by ancient Near Eastern traditions, where creatures similar to the Leviathan often symbolized the primordial chaos the gods had to overcome to create an ordered world. In the biblical context, however, the Leviathan is not an equal adversary to God, but a powerful creature entirely under the Creator's control. This idea of the Leviathan as a symbol of chaos controlled by God is further developed in Psalm 104, a hymn of praise to divine creation. In verse 26, the psalmist declares, "There the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there." This passage presents a surprising image. The fearsome Leviathan, far from being a threat, is portrayed almost as a plaything in God's hands. This description emphasizes God's absolute power over all creation, even its most formidable and chaotic parts. In this context, the Leviathan is not merely a monster to be feared, but a testimony to God's greatness and creative power. This perspective invites us to see the natural world, with all its beauty and terror, as an expression of divine majesty. However, the story of the Leviathan in the Bible does not end with these poetic descriptions. In the book of Isaiah, we find an intriguing reference that adds a new layer of meaning to this symbol. In Isaiah 27:1 we read, "In that day the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great and powerful sword, Leviathan the gliding serpent, Leviathan the coiling serpent, he will slay the monster of the sea." This passage is particularly interesting because it presents the Leviathan as an enemy that God will defeat in the future on the day of judgment. Here, the Leviathan seems to represent not just natural chaos, but spiritual forces of evil that oppose God and his people. This apocalyptic interpretation of the Leviathan opens up new possibilities for understanding the meaning of this creature in biblical theology. The mention of the Leviathan in Isaiah as a serpent and a dragon leads us to consider other biblical passages that use similar imagery. In the book of Revelation, for example, we find the description of a great red dragon who is identified as that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, Revelation 12:9. Although the Leviathan is not mentioned by name in Revelation, the similarities in language and symbolism are striking. Many interpreters have seen a connection between the Leviathan of the Old Testament and the forces of evil described in the New Testament. This interpretation suggests that the Leviathan, in addition to representing natural chaos, also symbolizes the spiritual forces that oppose God and his plan for creation. In this sense, God's promise to defeat the Leviathan becomes a promise of final victory over all evil and chaos in the universe. However, it is important to note that not all interpretations of the Leviathan in the Judeo-Christian tradition view it as a purely negative symbol. Some ancient rabbis, for example, had a more positive view of the Leviathan. In Rabbinic literature, we find stories about how God created the Leviathan on the fifth day of creation, and how, at the end of times, the Leviathan's flesh will be served at a banquet for the righteous. Although not part of the canonical biblical text, these traditions reflect an understanding of the Leviathan as an integral part of God's good creation, destined to fulfill a positive role in the divine plan. This perspective reminds us that even the parts of creation that may seem frightening or chaotic to us have a place in God's design. Returning to the description of the Leviathan in Job, we find a fascinating detail that often goes unnoticed. In verse 18 of chapter 41 we read, "Its snorting throws out flashes of light. Its eyes are like the rays of dawn." This poetic image of the Leviathan exhaling light is particularly intriguing. Some commentators have suggested that this could allude to some form of bioluminescence, a phenomenon observed in certain marine creatures. Others interpret this passage more symbolically, seeing in it a reference to the divine nature of the Leviathan as a creature that somehow reflects the glory of its creator. Regardless of the specific interpretation, this description emphasizes the extraordinary and almost supernatural nature of the Leviathan, a creature that seems to defy the normal categories of the natural world. The description of the Leviathan in Job continues with more impressive details. Flames stream from its mouth, sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke pours from its nostrils as from a boiling pot over burning reeds. Job 41:19-20. These images evoke a creature that is not only physically imposing, but also possesses an almost magical or supernatural quality. The mention of fire and smoke brings to mind descriptions of theophanies, divine manifestations, in other parts of the Bible, such as God's appearance to Moses in the burning bush or his descent on Mount Sinai. This resemblance raises intriguing questions about the nature of Leviathan and its connection to the divine. Could Leviathan be a manifestation of God's power in creation, or are these descriptions simply a poetic way of highlighting the extraordinary nature of this creature? A particularly intriguing aspect of the Leviathan's description in Job is the emphasis on its invulnerability. Its heart is hard as a rock, hard as a lower millstone. Job 41:24. This image of a heart as hard as a stone could be interpreted in several ways. On one hand, it might underscore Leviathan's physical strength and resilience. On the other hand, on a more symbolic level, it could suggest an unyielding and indifferent nature, a creature unmoved by pity or compassion. This interpretation aligns with the idea of Leviathan as a representation of the impersonal and relentless forces of nature that operate without regard for human desires or needs. However, it's crucial to remember that, in the biblical view, even this seemingly invincible and implacable creature is under God's absolute control. The final statement about Leviathan in Job, "It looks down on all that are haughty, it is king over all that are proud," deserves a deeper analysis. This enigmatic phrase elevates Leviathan to an almost divine status, placing it above all other creatures. However, it's important to recall the context in which this statement is made. God is speaking to Job, a man who has questioned divine justice. By describing such an imposing and untamable creature, God effectively reminds Job of his insignificance compared to the wonders of creation. In this context, Leviathan is a mirror reflecting God's majesty. If a mere creature is already impressive and beyond human comprehension, how much more so is the Creator himself? This interpretation is reinforced when we consider the following verse. God declares, "Everything under heaven belongs to me." Job 41:11. Thus, no matter how powerful Leviathan may be, it remains a creature subject to divine authority. This passage invites us to reflect on our position in the cosmos. If even Leviathan, king over all that are proud, is subject to God, what right do we humans have to question the Almighty's ways? This reflection brings us back to the central theme of the book of Job, the absolute sovereignty of God and the necessity of human trust and submission, even in circumstances we do not fully understand. Expanding our analysis beyond the book of Job, we find other intriguing references to Leviathan in biblical and extra-biblical literature. In Psalm 104, verse 26, as we mentioned earlier, Leviathan is described almost as a plaything in God's hands. There the ships go to and fro, and Leviathan, which you formed to frolic there. This image contrasts sharply with the terrifying description in Job, presenting a more benign perspective of the creature. How can we reconcile these seemingly contradictory views? One possible interpretation is that these descriptions reflect God's nature and relationship with creation. In Job, Leviathan exemplifies God's incomprehensible power, emphasizing the distance between the divine and the human. In Psalm 104, on the other hand, Leviathan is presented as part of a harmonious and well-ordered creation, reflecting the wisdom and care of the Creator. This duality reminds us that in biblical theology, God is both transcendent, beyond our understanding, and immanent, present and active in His creation. Leviathan is a powerful symbol of this complex theological reality in its various representations. Furthermore, the image of Leviathan as God's plaything in Psalm 104 can be seen as an affirmation of God's absolute control over the forces of chaos. Even the most fearsome and powerful creature is ultimately subservient to divine will. This perspective offers comfort and security to the faithful, reminding them that everything is under God's sovereign control, no matter how chaotic or frightening the world may seem. The complexity of Leviathan's symbolism becomes even more evident when we consider its appearance in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 27:1, we read, "In that day the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great and powerful sword, Leviathan the gliding serpent, Leviathan the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea." In an apocalyptic context, this passage presents Leviathan as an enemy God will defeat in the future. The language used here, gliding serpent, coiling serpent, monster of the sea, evokes images of cosmic chaos and evil. This representation of Leviathan aligns with ancient Near Eastern mythological traditions, where similar creatures often symbolized the forces of chaos that oppose the order of life. However, it's important to note that in the biblical context, the Leviathan is not presented as a power equal to God, but as a creature that, no matter how powerful, is destined for ultimate defeat at the hands of the Creator. This promise of victory over Leviathan in Isaiah can be interpreted on multiple levels. Historically, it might refer to Israel's deliverance from its political enemies. Cosmically, it could symbolize God's final victory over all the forces of evil and chaos in the universe. On a personal and spiritual level, it may represent the promise that God will ultimately defeat all the monsters that threaten our lives and faith, whether fear, doubt, sin, or death. Thus, the image of Leviathan in Isaiah, far from merely a mythological curiosity, becomes a powerful symbol of hope and redemption. The portrayal of Leviathan as a force of evil to be defeated by God leads us to consider potential connections between this creature and other evil figures in biblical and apocalyptic literature. For example, in the book of Revelation, we find the image of a great red dragon, identified as that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, Revelation 12:9. Although Leviathan is not mentioned by name in Revelation, the similarities in language and symbolism are striking. Both creatures are described as dragons or serpents. Both are associated with the sea. The dragon in Revelation is depicted as emerging from the sea, and both are presented as adversaries that God will defeat. These similarities have led many interpreters to see a connection between the Leviathan of the Old Testament and the forces of evil described in the New Testament. This line of interpretation suggests that Leviathan evolved from a symbol primarily associated with natural chaos throughout biblical history to a more explicit representation of spiritual evil. However, it's important to note that this interpretation is not universally accepted, and many scholars argue that we should be cautious in directly equating Leviathan with Satan or other evil figures. Regardless of the specific interpretation, Leviathan, in its various biblical manifestations, is a powerful symbol of the forces that oppose divine order, natural, political, or spiritual. The Bible consistently affirms that God, in His sovereignty and power, will have dominion over all these forces. A fascinating aspect of the Leviathan legend worth exploring is its presence in Rabbinic literature and Jewish mystical traditions. The Talmud and other Rabbinic texts offer intriguing elaborations on the nature and destiny of the Leviathan. One particularly intriguing tradition states that God originally created 2 male and female Leviathans. However, fearing that these creatures might reproduce and destroy the world, God killed the female and reserved her flesh for a messianic banquet that would take place at the end of time. The male, on the other hand, was kept alive but sterilized. Although this narrative is not part of the canonical biblical text, it offers a unique perspective on the Leviathan. It suggests that far from being merely a force of evil, the Leviathan is an integral part of God's good creation, destined to fulfill a positive purpose in the divine plan. The idea of the messianic banquet, where the righteous will feast on the flesh of the Leviathan, can be interpreted as a symbol of the final victory over chaos and disorder, and the restoration of perfect harmony in creation. Additionally, in Kabbalistic tradition, the Leviathan is often associated with the concept of Sitra Achra, or the other side, a shadowy realm that opposes divine holiness. In this interpretation, the Leviathan represents the forces of evil that are paradoxically necessary for the full development of the divine plan. These mystical traditions remind us that the Leviathan's symbolism is rich and multifaceted, resisting simplistic or one-dimensional interpretations. When considering the impact of the Leviathan on culture and art, we cannot ignore its influence on Western literature and philosophy. A notable example is Thomas Hobbes's use of the Leviathan as the central metaphor in his seminal work of political philosophy, Leviathan, published in 1651. Hobbes uses the image of the Leviathan to represent the sovereign state, a powerful and potentially fearsome entity, but necessary to maintain order and avoid the chaos of the war of all against all. This secular appropriation of biblical symbolism demonstrates the durability and adaptability of the Leviathan image as a symbol of power and authority. In literature, the Leviathan has inspired countless authors, from romantic poets such as William Blake, who depicted the Leviathan in his illustrations for the Book of Job, to modern science fiction and fantasy authors who often incorporate Leviathan-like creatures into their imaginary worlds. These artistic and literary representations of the Leviathan often explore themes of power, chaos, and the relationship between humanity and nature, echoing and expanding on the themes found in the original biblical sources. In cinema and popular culture, creatures inspired by the Leviathan appear in monster films, video games, and comic books, often retaining the overwhelming power and invulnerability characteristics of the biblical Leviathan. The persistence of the Leviathan in various cultural forms attests to the enduring power of this symbol to capture the human imagination and express our deepest anxieties and fascinations. When studying the Leviathan, an inevitable question is whether this creature corresponds to any known or extinct real animal. Over the centuries, many theories have been proposed, suggesting that the Leviathan might be a poetic description of animals like crocodiles, whales, or even extinct aquatic dinosaurs, such as the plesiosaur. Some scholars argue that the description, with its references to scales, incredible strength, and aquatic habitat, aligns well with the characteristics of a large Nile crocodile. Others point to mentions of king over all the children of pride and the ability to produce fire and smoke, indicating that the Leviathan cannot be identified with any known creature. An intermediate perspective suggests that the biblical Leviathan may have been inspired by real animals, but was elaborated and mythologized to the point of becoming a distinct legendary creature. It is important to note that the search for a real Leviathan may be misguided if it does not consider the literary and theological context in which this creature is presented in the Bible. The Leviathan is a theological symbol and rhetorical device, not a zoological description. Its function in the text is to convey truths about God, creation, and the human condition, not to provide scientific information about ancient marine life. However, the debate over the possible physical basis of the Leviathan continues to fascinate many scholars and laypeople, illustrating the enduring power of this image to stimulate our curiosity and imagination. When reflecting on the significance of the Leviathan for modern Bible readers, it is crucial to consider how this ancient image can be relevant in a world shaped by science and technology. In some ways, the Leviathan continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the limits of human knowledge and power. Just as Job was confronted with the vastness and mystery of creation, we too are often reminded of our smallness in the face of the forces of nature. Pandemics and the vast expanses of space remind us that, despite all our technological progress, there are still many things beyond our control. In this context, the image of the Leviathan can help us cultivate healthy humility and a sense of wonder before the universe. At the same time, faith in a powerful God can be a source of comfort and hope in times of uncertainty and fear. From a more metaphorical perspective, the Leviathan can represent the monsters we face in our daily lives, whether they be personal challenges, social injustices, or global crises. The biblical narrative of the Leviathan reminds us that, no matter how frightening these challenges may seem, they are not insurmountable from the perspective of faith. Just as God is portrayed as having power over the Leviathan, faith encourages us to believe that no problem is too great to be overcome with divine help. This perspective can be a source of courage and resilience in facing life's difficulties. An important dimension in exploring the Leviathan is its role in eco-theology and Christian environmental ethics. The description of the Leviathan as a powerful and majestic creature created and controlled by God can lead us to reflect on our relationship with the natural world. If even a creature as formidable as the Leviathan is seen as part of God's good creation, what attitude should we have toward the rest of nature? This perspective can encourage us to respect and admire nature, even for its seemingly most threatening aspects. The Leviathan reminds us that creation does not exist merely to serve human purposes, but has its own intrinsic value in God's eyes. Furthermore, the image of the Leviathan as a force that God controls but does not eliminate can help us think more nuancedly about our relationship with the natural environment. Instead of seeking to dominate or conquer nature, we may be called to find ways to coexist harmoniously with it, recognizing both its power and fragility. This eco-theological interpretation that God will eventually defeat the Leviathan can be understood not as a justification for the reckless exploitation of natural resources, but as a hope that harmony will ultimately be restored among all parts of creation. As we approach the end of our exploration of the Leviathan, it is important to consider how this complex symbol relates to broader issues of faith and spirituality. In its various biblical manifestations, the Leviathan invites us to reflect on the nature of evil, the power of God, and the limits of human understanding. On one level, the Leviathan represents chaos and destructive forces that threaten order and peace, whether in nature, society, or our lives. The biblical promise that God has power over the Leviathan can be seen as an affirmation of the ultimate victory of good over evil, of order over chaos. This perspective can offer hope and comfort in times of crisis and uncertainty. However, it is crucial to remember that, in the biblical narrative, the Leviathan is not simply eliminated, but remains as part of God's creation. This suggests a more complex view of reality, where chaos is not entirely eradicated but is controlled and even serves a purpose in the divine plan. This tension between order and chaos, good and evil, understanding and mystery, is at the heart of many spiritual traditions. It can be a fertile source for reflection and personal growth. The Leviathan challenges us to embrace paradox and ambiguity in our spiritual journey, recognizing that not all questions have simple answers, and that mystery is an essential part of the religious experience. As we conclude our journey through the world of the Leviathan, we see that this ancient symbol continues to have a profound and multifaceted impact on our understanding of faith, the world, and ourselves. From the terrifying descriptions in the Book of Job to the poetic depictions in the Psalms, exploring the apocalyptic interpretations in Isaiah and the New Testament, and modern reflections on ecology and spirituality, the Leviathan is more than a sea monster or a mythological curiosity. It is a complex symbol that invites us to contemplate great existential questions: the power and majesty of God, the nature of good and evil, the limits of human knowledge, our relationship with the natural world. The Leviathan challenges us to expand our understanding of faith, going beyond simple and comfortable answers. It reminds us that the universe is vast, mysterious, and sometimes frightening, but is in the hands of a wise and powerful Creator. At the same time, the Leviathan invites us to adopt an attitude of humility and wonder before creation, recognizing that there is much we do not understand and cannot control. This perspective can be liberating, allowing us to let go of the need for absolute control and open ourselves to a deeper and more authentic relationship with God and the world around us. May the Leviathan continue to intrigue, challenge, and inspire future generations, always reminding us of the greatness and mystery of divine creation. We have reached the end of our video, and I hope you like it. If you're looking for inspiration, knowledge, and spiritual connection, don't let this opportunity pass you by. Subscribe to our channel now, leave your like and comment to strengthen our community. And if you want to help us continue sharing religious stories that touch hearts, become a channel member. Together we can make a difference and strengthen our spiritual journey. We're counting on you. We've left the link in the description of this video so you can become a member today. Continue watching videos about the history of the Bible. I will leave 2 recommendations here on the screen. God bless you. We will get to the next video.